This lesson is handling multiple promises in JavaScript. The objectives for this lesson are to understand how to use the methods associated with the promise object to execute multiple functions. Each function operates asynchronously, and the success or failure of the different methods will depend on which method you invoke. The idea here is to run multiple functions in the background, and we run these via static methods on the promise object. We have Promise.all, Promise.allSettled, Promise.any, and Promise.race. The Promise.all method takes an iterable list of promise objects, some sort of array or collection, and it returns a single promise. And this promise is fulfilled if all promises succeed. So to the all, you pass an array of promises that you get back or calls to a bunch of different functions, and then it returns a promise that is fulfilled once all of them succeed. Now, if any of the promises fails, then the returned promise fails as well. Let's take a look at using the Promise.all method in JavaScript. This HTML file relies on a script called movie-success.js. So if we go over here and we look for movie-success.js, you'll see that I've got a function called fetchMovieData that returns a new promise. And all it's going to do is just set a timeout for 3 seconds and then return the resolve. We have a fetchActorData, which does basically the same thing, but this one returns it after 2 seconds. We also have a fetchGenreData, which returns a new promise that resolves after 1 second. So back here in our all, we're going to create these 3 promises by calling each one of those functions. So we've got let promise1 equals fetchGenreData, let promise2 equals fetchMovieData, let promise3 equal fetchActorData. We then take each of those promises and pass it in an array to the Promise.all static method. Then we get the values back, and if that value comes back as resolved, then they all have succeeded. So let's take a look here. So now you can see we get all 3 of them have succeeded because they were all success. Now let's take a look at what would happen if one of those promises failed in the Promise.all. This HTML file relies on a script called movie-error.js. So inside of this one, we have a fetchMovieData, has a promise, so pretty much like the other one, but the fetchActorData is a little different now. This is the one where if you pass in a true or false value, for instance, then, it could reject or resolve that particular promise. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just reject it, just right out of hand. I'm just going to say if true, let's reject. The fetchGenreData is exactly the same as what we had before. So we know that one of these is going to fail. So I'm going to get my 3 promises again by doing let promise1 equals fetchGenreData, let promise2 equals fetchMovieData, and let promise3 equal fetchActorData. Now I take and pass all of those as an array to the Promise.all method. I have the then portion, so if everything succeeds, then it goes into the then. But if one of these fails, it's going to go into the catch method. Now we know that one of those is going to fail, so we see that it does indeed go into the catch block. So it has an error fetching the actor data. So it's the last one that fails, but because that one failed, it's going to report a failure, even though the other 2 may have succeeded. Now, this is not like a transaction. It's not like it's going to roll back any of those other things. It just means that it's saying one out of those many ones that were passed has failed. The next static method is Promise.all.settled, where it again takes an iterable list of promise objects and it returns a single promise. So same thing, but this promise is now an array of objects describing the success or failure of each promise. So if a promise fails, all the other promises continue to run, and the object that fails will have the error message. Let's take a look at using the Promise.all.Settled method in JavaScript. This HTML file is again going to rely on that movie-success.js that we saw before. It's going to go ahead and create our 3 promises. We're now going to pass those 3 promises as an array to the allSettled method on the promise object. And I know that all those are going to be successful, so I just have a simple then here. Let's go ahead and run this. And we'll take a look at what we get back. So you can see now we're getting back an array, and that array then has an object literal. Each element of that array has an object literal that tells us the status of the promise and what the return value was from each promise. And once again, let's take a look at having one of those promises fail when passed to allSettled. Once again, this HTML file is going to rely on movie-error.js. We create our 3 promises by calling our fetch genre data, fetch movie data, and fetch actor data. We pass all 3 of those promises to the allSettled, but this time I actually have a catch block in there. But let's take a look at what happens with this one now. We know that one of these is going to fail, right? In this movie error, okay, I have made it such that the fetch actor data is going to reject. So if you remember that. So when we come into here, what's going to happen? Let's run this, bring up our window. We're not getting the catch block because we're getting that array, and that array is telling us the status. And you can see that fetch actor data was rejected. And it then has a reason property there that says why it rejected. So it's going to give you basically an array with a result of each promise, whether it was success or failure. Let's now take a look at the Promise.any static method. This one also takes an iterable list of promise objects and it returns a single promise. So all of these are basically the same in how they process things. But this promise is fulfilled when any promise succeeds and the promise is rejected if all promises are rejected. Let's take a look at using the Promise.any method in JavaScript. In this any.html, we're using our movie success. We're going to create our 3 promises by calling the 3 individual functions. We pass those 3 as an array to the any method, and we have a then. Let's go ahead and run this and see what this looks like. So you see we get just back a single value. The single value is that first one has succeeded. So it says, oh, hey, one of them succeeded. Great, I'm done. All right, it's done. The promise resolved. Doesn't even care about what the other 2 and whether or not they have succeeded or failed. Once that first one succeeds, that's it. Let's now take a look at the scenario where all promises are going to fail and see how the Promise.any handles that. This HTML file now is using the script movie-error-all. If we take a look at this one, you'll see that each one of these is going to reject. So all 3 of these are going to reject. So that means that when I am now using the any and I pass in the array of promises that each one of these are going to reject, we're going to hit that catch block. Let's go ahead and try running this, bring this up. And there you can see we get an aggregate error. All promises were rejected. The Promise.race method is again going to take an iterable list of promise objects and it's going to return a single promise that we can then process. This promise is fulfilled when the first promise succeeds. The promise is rejected if the first promise finished is rejected. So if you have promises that finish at different times, it's going to be looking at each one and it's going to be fulfilled when the first one succeeds, or it's going to be rejected if the first promise finished is rejected. Let's take a look at using the Promise.race method in JavaScript. In this HTML file, we're using the movie-success, so all of them are going to succeed. We create our 3 promises. We then pass those 3 promises as an array to the race method of the promise object. And the one that finishes first is going to be the one that reports back that this is now successful. So again, we'll run this. And we can see the first one that came back was that fetch genre data, because if you remember, that one only takes 1 second to run. They're all three running and doing their thing, but this is just reporting back the first one. Let's now take a look at if one of these fails, the first one fails, what happens with the Promise.race response that we get back. In this HTML file, we're now using the script movie-error.js. We're going to get our 3 promises. We're then going to pass those as an array to the Promise.race. And the first one that resolves, if that one is rejected, then this whole promise will be rejected. So we take a look, and yes, it says, hey, the first one that rejected was the actor data, because that's the first one that it reported back. So the whole promise then is rejected. Even though the others may succeed, if that first one, if that's the one that's rejected, then the whole promise is rejected. In this lesson, we learned to run many background functions using all selected, any, and the race static methods on the promise object. And then we saw the results of each one of those on whether they succeeded or failed. Coming up next, employing the Web Workers API in JavaScript.